I always thought life insurance was for other people until I got a call that changed everything. It wasn't a salesman, it was my eldest son asking a question I hadn't prepared for. He wasn't asking for money, he was asking about my end-of-life plan. In this episode, I share the real story and the financial and emotional mess I nearly left behind. If you're over 50 or love someone who is, this one's for you. This is the story of how Mark, the invincible man, became the invisible man. Mark was a legend. That's what everyone called him. He wasn't content with just watching the match. He was in the thick of the ruck, driving forward through pain. If it was tough, gritty, and required a relentless disregard for injury, Mark was there. He lived by one philosophy: you only regret the meters you didn't gain. He built his world on impact, noise, and sheer willpower, and that was the problem. The lessons Mark learned smashing through defensive lines were the same ones that pushed his family away decades later. The man who was invincible in the scrum was stubbornly blind in his own living room at 70. It all started with 3 critical mistakes he made when the final whistle blew on his career. The first mistake was the adrenaline trap. Mark had a body built for collision. Every rib crack, every ligament tear, every bruised joint was a war story for the clubhouse. He prioritized the next match over preventative health. He saw maintenance, stretching, clean eating, physical therapy as soft, something weak men did. He never developed a baseline of sustainable health. He spent his entire youth making deposits in the pain bank, and when he hit 50, that bank started demanding interest. When the knees gave out and the back seized up, Mark couldn't pivot. He didn't have a plan B. He only knew how to play through the pain. This meant his movement stopped, his life started to shrink, and his family had to watch him sideline himself permanently. This led directly to mistake number 2, the Iron Man myth. In the locker room, vulnerability got you benched. You played hurt. You didn't complain. You didn't talk about it. When his wife tried to talk about the stresses of his work, Mark would just snap. "I handle it." He applied the same principle to his body. He ignored his escalating blood pressure. He never spoke to anyone after his team lost the championship. He kept the medical and emotional engine running until it exploded. By refusing to admit a problem, he forced his family to walk on emotional eggshells. They learned not to ask, not to probe, and ultimately, not to rely on him for emotional support. The Iron Man became a stone statue, revered, but incapable of human connection. The third mistake was internal: the work harder lie. Mark genuinely believed exhaustion was a status symbol. He told his kids, "I'm doing this for you." But in reality, he was using work as the next intense field of play, a place to earn respect and escape the quiet complexity of home life. He missed birthdays, school plays, and simple weekends. He believed the effort justified the absence, but his family didn't need a provider who was never there. They needed a father and husband. The irony? When he finally retired, the game was gone, but the habit of absence remained. He still didn't know how to fill that chair. The work harder lie was exhausting, but it was just the beginning of Mark's midlife drift. The next mistakes weren't about what he did, they were about what he failed to do as the noise of his youth faded and silence crept in. Mark was a huge risk taker on the field. He'd put his body on the line without a thought, but when it came to his money, he didn't calculate long-term risk. He just coasted. He treated his finances the way he treated his knee injury. He only paid attention when it forced him to stop. He had life insurance, the kind his workplace offered, but he never reviewed it. He just assumed that the small policy he signed up for in his 20s was enough for his life in his 50s. He failed to calculate the long, slow financial drain of aging, the chronic care, the deductibles, the fact that you might live 20 years longer than planned. Mark saved, yes, but he didn't plan for decline. He didn't plan for the inevitable collision between the body he played hard in and the medical bills it would rack up later. And that financial uncertainty, that quiet anxiety, bled into his family life, turning opportunities into questions of affordability. Building on the Iron Man myth, Mark developed mistake number 5, the communication silence. In rugby, you communicate with grunts and physical signals. You don't have time for nuance. Mark brought that brutal efficiency home. When his wife Sarah tried to talk about their kids' issues, Mark would nod and say, "Just tell me what needs to be done." He replaced difficult emotional conversations with emotional withdrawal. He created a safe zone of silence where he couldn't be challenged or required to be vulnerable. He thought silence meant stability, but silence in a relationship isn't neutral. It's a vacuum, and vacuums pull things apart. His children, realizing their deep problems were met only with shallow answers, stopped bringing them to him. They learned to seek wisdom and comfort elsewhere. Mark's identity was tied up in the collision and the competition. When he stopped playing, he never replaced that singular joy. This was the hobby fade. He traded the excitement of the try line for the dull stability of a manager's desk. He sacrificed joy for the sake of responsibility. He was too tired for golf, too stiff for running, and too proud to join a casual community league. The passions that had once made him Mark, the intense adventurous spirit, were allowed to die on the vine. When his life lost its internal momentum, Mark began to rely entirely on his family to provide all his fulfillment and entertainment. This placed an unfair, crushing burden on them. His burden became their problem. Mark's primary social network was his team. Every friend was a teammate, a coach, or a fellow competitor. Once he left the sport and corporate team, he had nothing left. His friendships were situational and transactional. He never learned how to maintain a friendship of choice, one that existed purely for emotional support, laughter, or shared vulnerability. By retirement, Mark hadn't just lost his job or his sport, he had lost his entire social infrastructure. The man who was always surrounded by a scrum of men was now facing a profound, isolating social desert. The midlife drift eventually hit the rocks. As Mark approached retirement, the small habits he'd cultivated suddenly became huge chasms between him and his family. This is the crisis point, where the damage is undeniable and the pushback from loved ones starts becoming visible. Mark always believed he was sacrificing his time for his kids' future, but he made a terrible mistake, the no-time habit. He thought the value was in the big moments, the college tuition, the down payment on a house. He completely missed the value of the small, ordinary moments, the 5 minutes helping with homework, the spontaneous afternoon ice cream run, the quiet drive. His children internalized this message. Dad doesn't have time for the small things, so their small problems, the ones they needed help with most, were never brought to him. You can never go back and recapture the trust and comfort that is built in those everyday, unremarkable moments. The legacy of a life well lived is not the size of the check, it's the depth of the connection, and Mark's well was running dry. As the present became painful, Mark retreated further into the past. This was the nostalgia trap. Every conversation became a vehicle to discuss past glories, the winning try, the massive corporate deal, the time things were simpler. He didn't just share memories, he used them as a club to beat the present. He constantly told his children and grandchildren how easy they had it. He was living entirely in the hallowed past, refusing to acknowledge the reality and the challenges of the world his family actually inhabited. When you cling too tightly to who you were, you prevent yourself from embracing who you can be now. This habit pushes people away because nobody wants to feel like their current efforts and struggles are less than. The final crisis point was physical, but its consequences were emotional. The denial of physical change. The rugby player in his mind still had a 20-year-old body. He still tried to lift the same weights, jump the same heights, and ignore the same pains. He saw the need for a cane or the need to slow down as a moral failure, a surrender to weakness. His stubborn resistance led to accidents, small ones at first, then the fall that sent him to the hospital. This forced his family into the role of caregivers and protectors, a shift neither he nor they were emotionally ready for. His body had finally betrayed him, but his refusal to gracefully accept change was the true source of the heartbreak. He spent his whole life playing through pain, only to realize that the one game he couldn't beat was Father Time. The hospital stay was a temporary pause, but when Mark got home, he returned to the same old habits, now amplified by physical frailty. He was an older man facing the end of his life, but he was still clinging to that rigid mindset of the young, invincible rugby player. He was an older man facing the end of his life, but he was still clinging to the rigid mindset of the young, invincible rugby player. This final stage is marked by isolation, a self-imposed exile from the people who still cared. After his fall, Mark needed connection more than ever, but his rigidity created the stubborn wall. The world had moved on. His family communicated through shared photos, quick texts, and video calls. Mark, still fighting his battle against soft technology, saw this as a moral failure of the younger generation, not an opportunity for connection. He refused to learn the apps, He resisted the new phone his son bought him. He thought his resistance was a principled stand against modernity, but it was simply a choice to be excluded. By refusing to adapt, he essentially put up a massive technological barrier. He was telling his family implicitly, "You must come to me on my terms in my outdated world." They didn't stop caring, but they did stop trying to bridge a gap that only Mark could close. His stubbornness made him invisible to the rhythm of their modern lives. As the invitations slowed and the phone calls became shorter, Mark retreated into the legacy illusion. He assumed his past achievements, the trophies, the years of providing, the sheer effort would speak for him. He believed his work accomplishments were louder than his personal presence. He waited for his children and grandchildren to come sit at his feet and hear the tales of his grit and success. When they didn't, he became bitter and judgmental. What Mark failed to grasp is that a legacy is not an inheritance of trophies. It is a continuation of shared humanity and vulnerability. His family didn't need to be impressed. They needed to be included in his life now. They needed him to be a listener, not a monument. He spent decades building an impressive life, only to find that the only thing his family valued was the part of him he never gave them, his unfiltered self. This brings us to the most heartbreaking mistake of all, the final regret. It wasn't the failure of his body or the lack of money, it was the realization of who he had pushed away and why. In his loneliest moments, Mark didn't miss the roar of the crowd or the thrill of the tackle. He missed the sound of laughter that no longer filled his home. He missed the vulnerability of his son's teenage troubles that he had waved off. He missed the simple, silent connection with his wife that had been suffocated by his silence. He realized too late that the walls he had built to protect himself from pain and vulnerability were the very same walls that made him lonely, isolated, and profoundly unhappy. The Iron Man myth didn't make him strong, it made him alone. And that realization, that regret, was the one pain he couldn't play through. The realization was a crushing blow, but it was also the final gift. Mark, the man who spent a lifetime avoiding pain, finally faced the most painful truth. The man he pushed away most often was the man he became. The ultimate lesson Mark learned is one that every man over 50 needs to hear. You cannot play through life's emotional pain. You cannot tackle your way out of vulnerability. You cannot save enough money to buy back the time you missed. And you cannot isolate yourself into independence without sacrificing meaning. The strength Mark believed he had came from his ability to endure. The true strength required in the final years comes from the ability to connect. It comes from saying, "I need help," or "I was wrong," or simply, "Tell me about your day." Your health insurance, your final plans, your health insurance, your financial plans, your legacy, none of it matters if you don't have the people to share it with. The real mess Mark left behind wasn't just financial, it was the emotional vacuum he created by his silence and stubbornness. It is never too late to put down the Iron Man armor. It is never too late to admit that the toughest game you ever played wasn't on the field, but in your own home. Don't wait for a life-altering phone call to force you to look at your plan. Don't wait until the walls are too high to climb. If you are Mark, the retired athlete, the tired executive, the quiet father, the time to make amends and build bridges is now. If Mark's story resonated with you, and if you recognize any of these 13 habits in your own life or the life of someone you love, take action. First, click the like button on this video. Your support helps this vital message reach other men who need to hear it. Second, we want to hear your story. Which of these 13 mistakes was the most heartbreaking for you to watch or the hardest for you to stop? Share your answer in the comments below. Third, and most important, use the clarity you've gained today. Send that text asking, "How are you really doing?" Schedule that doctor's appointment you've been putting off, because the final whistle blows for everyone. Make sure your last memory is of connection, not isolation.